Donald Trump's ambitious plan to tighten his grip on Washington, D.C.'s police force unraveled in full public view, marking a dramatic political misstep that even his most loyal supporters struggled to defend. In a week where the political stage was already heavy with tension, Trump's proposed meeting with Vladimir Putin in Alaska collapsed before it could even take shape, leaving reporters buzzing and critics pouncing on the apparent diplomatic failure. The press conference that followed became a spectacle of its own, as Trump repeatedly referred to Alaska as Russia, a slip or perhaps a stubborn insistence that only fueled speculation about his intentions and geopolitical stance. Russian officials remained silent, but the ripple effect in the USS media was immediate, triggering a surge of headlines questioning the administration's competence. The White House press room, usually a place of measured questions and rehearsed answers, transformed into a scene of barely contained chaos as a record number of reporters crowded in, eager to capture every stumble, every hesitant pause from the president. Camera shutters clicked relentlessly, and the hum of whispered speculation filled the space like static before a storm. Among the political figures weighing in, Senator Lindsey Graham emerged as one of the few voices openly supporting Trump's intention to meet with Putin, framing it as a bold step toward resetting U.S.-Russia relations. Yet even his defense was met with raised eyebrows, as pundits questioned whether the political cost of such a meeting, especially under these circumstances, could ever outweigh the potential gains. For many, the mere suggestion that Vladimir Putin would step foot on Alaskan soil sounded like the plot of a political thriller, but in Washington, it was treated as a very real possibility, one rooted in a complex web of recent policy moves. Trump's announcement that the United States would be selling advanced weaponry to European nations in an effort to bolster Ukraine's defenses was seen in Moscow as a direct provocation. Kremlin insiders, speaking off the record, hinted that Putin's interest in Alaska was less about diplomacy and more about sending a message. Russia would not stand idly by as the U.S. armed its adversaries. Adding to the tension, Trump had recently imposed a steep 50% tariff on Russian oil exported to India, a move that not only strained U.S.-Russia relations, but also disrupted global energy markets. In this volatile climate, Putin's planned visit seemed less like a diplomatic exchange and more like the opening gambit in a high-stakes geopolitical chess match. Gavin McCarthy, never one to shy away from confrontation, seized the moment to launch a blistering attack not on Trump, but on California's own governor, Gavin Newsom. Standing before a row of flags and speaking with a calculated blend of outrage and certainty, McCarthy accused Newsom of orchestrating an illegal redistricting scheme designed to tilt the political playing field in his party's favor. His words cut through the usual partisan noise, framing the accusation not just as a local issue but as a national threat to democratic integrity. Analysts were quick to point out that while accusations of gerrymandering were hardly new in American politics, McCarthy's decision to connect the scandal to the broader climate of political mistrust gave it far more weight. Social media lit up instantly. Hashtags combining both Gavin's names trended within hours, and pundits speculated whether this public clash could reshape California's political map for years to come. Texas Governor Greg Abbott, a figure well-versed in the battles of modern American politics, stepped into the fray with a tone that was both measured and unyielding. While he stopped short of defending Gavin McCarthy directly, Abbott made it clear that the issue of gerrymandering was far from confined to one state or one political party. Speaking to a crowd in Austin, he warned that the manipulation of electoral boundaries, whether in California, New York, or anywhere else, eroded public trust in the system and poisoned the very roots of representative democracy. Yet Abbott's remarks carried a pointed edge, as he singled out other states for engaging in what he called brazen political engineering, a phrase that drew applause from some and thinly veiled irritation from others. Political commentators noted that Abbott's intervention was strategic. By criticizing gerrymandering elsewhere, he deflected attention from accusations aimed at his own state while positioning himself as a guardian of electoral fairness. In the ever-shifting chess game of U.S. politics, Abbott's words were not just commentary. They were a move calculated to reshape the board. Jeanine Pirro, the formidable U.S. prosecutor in Washington, delivered her remarks with the sharp precision of someone who had spent decades in the courtroom, unafraid to draw blood with her words. Standing at a podium flanked by law enforcement officials, she called for nothing less than a renewed, relentless fight against crime, painting a picture of a city that could either continue its downward trend in violence or slide back into chaos if vigilance faltered. Her speech, however, came with a surprising twist. Statistics showed that Washington, D.C. was experiencing its lowest crime levels in 30 years. Pirro acknowledged the progress but warned that complacency was the enemy, stressing that the moment the city let its guard down, criminal networks would sense weakness and exploit it. Her tone alternated between stern prosecutor and concerned citizen, an intentional blend meant to resonate with both policymakers and ordinary residents. The press seized on the irony, a call to arms delivered at a time of unprecedented safety, a reminder that in politics, perception often carries as much weight as reality. Greg Steube, a Republican lawmaker with a reputation for combative rhetoric, took direct aim at President Biden in a speech that seemed designed as much for the cameras as for the congressional record. With a tone that mixed indignation and certainty, he accused the administration of failing to address the economic hardships gripping ordinary Americans, pointing to rising costs, sluggish job growth, and a sense of instability that he claimed was eroding public confidence. But Steube didn't stop there. He drew a sharp line connecting Biden's leadership to the shadowy and unresolved controversies surrounding the Epstein dossier, suggesting that the same culture of secrecy and protection of elites was at play. The mention of Epstein sent a ripple through the room, the kind of name that instantly shifts the atmosphere from policy debate to scandal narrative. Supporters nodded, critics bristled, and the media pounced on the soundbite, ensuring it would be replayed on cable news for days. For Steube, the speech was more than a political jab. It was an attempt to plant a narrative in the public consciousness, one where Biden's perceived failures and the country's broader discontent were intertwined. Pete Hegseth, a familiar face in conservative media circles, took to the airwaves with an analysis that was equal parts speculation and provocation. He painted an almost cinematic picture of what a Trump-Putin meeting in Alaska could have looked like: two leaders, seated across a table, flanked by stern-faced advisors. The conversation shifting from formal pleasantries to a startling proposal, an exchange of land between the United States and Russia. Hegseth framed the idea as unconventional, but potentially transformative, a maneuver that, in his words, could redefine the geopolitical map. Critics dismissed it as fantasy or dangerous naivety, while supporters argued that bold moves were exactly what was needed to break decades of diplomatic stalemate. The imagery-stuck commentators debated what parcels of land could possibly be on the table, what the trade-offs might entail, and whether such a deal could ever gain traction in the U.S. Congress. For Hegseth, the discussion wasn't just about policy. It was about reshaping public perception, about introducing the possibility of a deal so audacious it would force both allies and adversaries to reconsider their assumptions about American strategy. Dr. Jerome Adams, the former U.S. Surgeon General and a figure whose medical credentials lent immediate weight to his words, did not hide his frustration as he addressed the recent cuts to vaccine research funding. Speaking with a controlled but unmistakable edge in his voice, Adams warned that slashing budgets for critical immunization programs was not just short-sighted, but potentially catastrophic, especially in a world still reeling from the aftershocks of a global pandemic. He emphasized that vaccines were not a luxury to be debated in times of economic strain. They were a foundational pillar of public health, the very shield that kept communities safe from resurgent diseases. Critics of the cuts argued that the decision risked undoing decades of progress, leaving the nation vulnerable to outbreaks that could cripple hospitals and devastate local economies. Adams framed the issue as one of moral responsibility as much as policy, urging lawmakers to remember that public health investments were, in the end, investments in national security. The gravity in his tone made it clear. The consequences of inaction would not be measured in political points, but in human lives. The discussion of martial law, once relegated to the realm of political hypotheticals, began to take on a sharper and more immediate edge, as commentators debated whether the United States might actually see such a measure in the nation's capital. For Donald Trump and his closest advisors, the idea was presented not as a draconian overreach, but as a necessary safeguard in turbulent times, a decisive move to restore what they framed as order and stability. Reports emerged that Trump was exploring the federalization of Washington, D.C.'s police force, a step that would place local law enforcement directly under federal control and remove key decision-making powers from the city's leadership. Alongside this, there were indications that the National Guard could be deployed on a long-term basis, not merely as a reaction to unrest, but as a permanent fixture in the city's security apparatus. Supporters of the plan argued that such measures were essential to protect the federal government's functioning in the face of protests, crime, and what they called domestic threats, while critics saw it as a dangerous precedent that blurred the lines between civilian governance and military oversight. The tension in these debates was palpable, with both sides framing the issue as a test of the country's democratic resilience. Pete Hegseth returned to the conversation with a prediction that was as stark as it was controversial. If current trends continued, the military presence in Washington, D.C. might not just be a temporary measure but a permanent reality. Speaking with the air of someone unafraid to provoke, Hegseth argued that once the machinery of militarization is set in motion, it rarely retreats without leaving lasting marks on the city it occupies. He described a scenario in which uniformed soldiers and armored vehicles became as common a sight in the nation's capital as police cruisers, where the line between civilian life and military oversight blurred into something unrecognizable. For Hegseth, this was not a warning but a statement of inevitability, an outcome he claimed could bring unprecedented security, though critics insisted it would erode the very freedoms the military was supposed to protect. His words struck a chord, igniting a new round of debate, in which questions of safety, liberty, and identity became inseparably tangled. Would Washington become a fortress city, its streets watched over not by elected officials' directives, but by standing orders from a federal command? The question hung in the air, unanswered but impossible to ignore. The conversation soon shifted to a less obvious but equally telling aspect of the security debate: the role of the U.S. Park Police. In a move that surprised some and reassured others, officials discussed extending the presence of this specialized force well beyond its traditional duties of protecting monuments and national parks. The justification was framed around cost-effectiveness and logistical support. Park police could fill gaps in manpower, supplementing local law enforcement, without the same price tag as maintaining a full military deployment. Yet the exact duration of their expanded mission remained shrouded in uncertainty, with no clear end date or defined benchmarks for success. Proponents argued that their involvement would strengthen the overall law enforcement network, ensuring that federal property and high-profile areas remained secure in a period of political volatility. Critics countered that the move was yet another step toward normalizing an outsized federal role in city policing, warning that even temporary expansions of authority have a way of becoming permanent. In the absence of clarity, one truth lingered. The longer the park police stayed, the harder it would be to imagine Washington without them. The debate inevitably turned toward the broader question of law enforcement efficiency, a topic that had been simmering beneath the surface of every security discussion. Advocates of the administration's approach insisted that freeing local police from certain routine responsibilities would allow them to focus on higher priority crimes, thereby increasing their overall effectiveness. The conversation also touched on the contentious issue of cashless bail in so-called sanctuary cities, with critics claiming that such policies undermine public safety by releasing offenders back onto the streets too quickly. In Washington, D.C., the matter was further complicated by a patchwork of local laws and federal oversight, creating what some described as a bureaucratic maze where accountability was often lost. Proponents of reform argued that restructuring law enforcement duties was not about overreach, but about precision deploying resources where they could make the greatest impact. Opponents countered that these measures risk tipping the balance toward a more punitive, less community-oriented model of policing. At the heart of the dispute lay a single question: could efficiency and justice truly coexist, or would one inevitably come at the expense of the other? The proposal to establish a dedicated District of Columbia security fund was unveiled with the kind of fanfare usually reserved for major policy shifts. Officials framed it as a proactive step to hire more police officers, acquire cutting-edge surveillance technology, and integrate advanced analytics into the city's law enforcement operations. The stated goal was simple but ambitious: to make right now.